Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn c7 to c6. Knight b1 to c3. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight g1 to f3. Bishop c8 to g4. Pawn h2 to h3. Bishop g4 takes f3. Queen d1 takes f3. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d3. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn e4 to e5. Knight f6 to d7. Queen f3 to g3. Pawn d5 to d4. Knight c3 to e2. Pawn c6 to c5. Bishop c1 to d2. Knight b8 to c6. Pawn f2 to f4. Pawn g7 to g5. Queen g3 takes g5. Queen d8 takes g5. Pawn f4 takes g5. Knight d7 takes e5. Castle queenside. Bishop f8 to d6. King c1 to b1. Castle kingside. Knight e2 to g3. Bishop d6 to a7. Knight g3 to a4. Pawn a7 to a5. Knight e4 to f6, check. Bishop e7 takes f6. Pawn g5 takes f6. Pawn a5 to a4. Pawn g2 to g4. Pawn a4 to a3. Pawn b2 to b3. Pawn b7 to b5. Bishop d2 to f4. Rook a8 to c8. Rook d1 to e1. Knight e5 to d7. Pawn g4 to g5. Knight c6 to b4. Bishop f4 to d2. Knight b4 to d5. Bishop f1 to g2. Knight d5 to c3, check. Bishop d2 takes c3. Pawn d4 takes c3. Rook e1 to e3. Knight d7 to b6. Pawn h3 to h4. Rook f8 to d8. Pawn h4 to h5. Knight b6 to d5. Rook e3 to g3. Pawn c5 to c4. Pawn d3 takes c4. Pawn b5 takes c4. Bishop g2 takes d5. Rook d8 takes d5. Rook g3 takes c3. Rook d5 takes g5. King b1 to c1. Pawn h7 to h6. Pawn b3 to b4. Rook g5 to f5. Rook c3 takes a3. Rook f5 takes f6. Rook a3 to g3, check. King g8 to f8. King c1 to b2. Rook f6 to f4. Pawn a2 to a4. Pawn c4 to c3, check. King b2 to a3. King f8 to e7. Pawn a4 to a5. Pawn e6 to e5. Rook h1 to a1. Rook c8 to c4. Rook a1 to b1. Rook c4 to c8. Pawn a5 to a6. Rook c8 to c6. Pawn b4 to b5. Rook c6 to c4. Rook g3 to g1. Rook c4 to a4, check. King a3 to b3. Rook f4 to c4. Rook g1 to e1. King e7 to d6. Pawn b5 to b6. Rook a4 to b4, check. King b3 to a3. Rook b4 to a4, check. King a3 to b3. Rook a4 to b4, check. King b3 to a3. Rook b4 to a4, check. King a3 to b3, the game is a draw.